Hi, everybody. Welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graven. Our guest today is Evans Kerrigan. He is the co-founder and CEO of the firm Integris Performance Advisors. So before I tell you a little bit more about Evans, first off, thank you for being here. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me, Mark.
So Evans served in the United States Air Force before going into the private sector in the financial services industry. Again, the firm is Integris Performance Advisors, and Evans is co-author of a book with his colleague from the firm, Brett Cooper. The book is titled Solving the People Problem, Essential Skills You Need to Lead and Succeed in Today's Workplace. So we'll get to learn a little bit more about the book and delve in. But as we usually do here, Evans, first off, looking back at things, what would you say is your favorite mistake?
Well, I think that's such a wonderful question. And I'll be honest, Mark, when you asked for my favorite mistake, I actually started with a list. But I do want to go to one kind of favorite mistake that really kind of helped me in my career, and I think has helped a lot of our clients, actually. And I would reflect back to when I first started as a consultant. And so this is actually coming up on 20 years ago for me now. Coming out of corporate America, I was becoming a consultant. It was in the field of continuous improvement. So I was working with organizations to help improve their business processes, their ability to get stuff done for customers, as well as help the people in the organization. And that's part of what I had done while I was in corporate America as well. And I reflect back on one of the first clients that I had asked me to come in and actually help train some of their people in continuous improvement methodologies, how they could actually just fix what they were doing. And actually had me do some coaching of a few projects with them as well. And the client was actually happy with the results, and I was feeling like we actually left a lot on the table. And by that, here's what I mean. We were training people to do skills and techniques to figure out what was really happening in their business and improve those things. But several of the project teams I worked with, the answers that they came up with, the things that they found, didn't actually get implemented that way. They got changed along the way. There was somebody in leadership would say, "Yeah, but that's not what we're going to do here." Or there were a lot of things that got left on the table. We made a lot of money. Some of the projects delivered really great results, and I mean the ROI for the organization they were happy with. But I was really bothered by two things that I think they were kind of my fault, actually. The first was we didn't do enough kind of setting the ground for people to actually listen to what we found out about. So we would come to them with, "Hey, here's what we found, here's what we've learned," but we hadn't taken them along enough of that journey. So we kind of missed out in that mark. And the other thing that was really kind of a disappointment to me was the people we took through that, they got some support on a project, but they kind of didn't go out to try something else. So the organization didn't really change. A few of their processes changed, but the organization didn't. And so I was a little frustrated about that myself. Sure. And I think there's things that I should have done differently. And so it was one of those things where I kind of took a step back and said, "Wait a minute, how should I have approached this differently?" And there are some pretty good lessons I could take out of that one to kind of approach this in another way.
Yeah. So there's a lot we can dig into, I think, off of that story and scenario, Evans. I mean, one question that comes to mind, I mean, like, when did it sort of click or become apparent to you that there was this problem kind of underneath the surface success of the engagement, of that lost potential or leaving it on the table? When did you really start to see that?
It was actually the second of the projects. I was coaching, I think it was 5 or 6 different projects. And it was the second project where all of a sudden I realized, and should have kind of done a lot more work up front, I realized that leadership was not along for the journey on this one. And a team had put in good work, and then their answers weren't listened to. The data they had found wasn't listened to. And if you're in that situation, you're trying to get people to start to become more problem solvers, we really kind of set them up to fail. And it was me not asking the right kind of questions, not of the people I was coaching at all, but of leadership and of what the organizational culture was. And what I found was I was doing a really good job, I think, of working on some technical, tactical, technique, skill kind of areas. And I was missing what sometimes we call the soft stuff. The getting buy-in from people, the emotional intelligence, the team interactions, the leadership, really kind of the culture. And really what, as an outsider, what I needed to help them do was change the culture, not to actually solve the little problem that was the entering argument.
Do you think they agreed? Like, one thing I've run into, I do consulting work in a very similar space here. You might see the need or the potential for culture change, but do the leaders, like if they framed the situation as, hey, Evans, come in and help us fix some details in our process. Like, how do you find out if they're on board with culture change, or how would you try to maybe open their eyes to that possibility?
So I would say up front, what I probably was not aware of it, not quickly enough. And what I found out later on when I started to go back and work with them, because they were very happy with the results up front and wanted me to actually do more work. What I found was my conversations with them changed, and I started pushing in a little bit different way, really trying to make sure that we weren't going to take a team through work and then yank the rug out from under them. I mean, that was kind of my initial concern. I mean, what I also found was, although they were happy with that initial success, at least some of them started to question, okay, well, why weren't people kind of taking these skills further? Not realizing that they were actually part of that problem. So, and I think that's a normal thing that happens in organizations. And so I became much more aggressive at kind of really pushing that to the extent where I had one potential client who had brought me in as one of their finalists, and what they wanted was exactly what this first client had asked for. They wanted me to do training. They wanted to run some workshops. They wanted to do a little bit of that. And that was not actually what I wrote up that we were going to do. And actually, I just took the things they wanted to do and we put them all in the appendix. We said, okay, if you really want to change, here's what I think you need to do. And it's about culture. It's about leadership. It's about teams. It's about emotional intelligence. The skills are the easy part if I can change the mindset. So they asked me to come in, and I actually, in the final interview with them as one of the finalists, I actually grabbed a sheet of paper and wrote down a couple of consultants in their local area who could do what they were asking for, and handed that to them and said, if that's really what you want to have done, I don't want to be a part of it because I don't think you're going to end up happy with this a year or 2 years from now. Luckily, a couple of people on the team evidently seemed to agree with me because we did end up with that work. And actually, it was good work, but it was work where we had kind of said, we want to be your partners in this, not just your set of hands. Yeah. Right. And the fact that we had pushed that discussion with us kind of led to us being able to have a better discussion with the people who were learning about that and trying to do the work inside the organization as well.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I mean, it's one thing you mentioned earlier for the client to be happy with the results, but then there's also, I think, the question of what's sustainable, what happens when the consultant goes away, or what happens if there's a leadership change in the area. There's this question of, I think also what builds a culture. I'll share an example. The last manufacturing company I worked for before my work shifted into a healthcare focus, back in 2005. In this factory, they had trained, let's call it 500 people. It was roughly that. They had trained and certified 500 Six Sigma black belts. This is people doing the work. And you had to do a project to get certified, and they would have all the certificates on the wall. But I think, honestly, the number of projects completed was in the ballpark of like 503. Yeah. People did their certification project. They ticked that box. I don't know how many of those projects really led to sustainable change. But I think you're saying the same thing of it's not the fault of those belts of like, well, shame on you. Why didn't you do more projects? That's dependent on the environment, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for me, I look at all those continuous improvement methodologies and say they're cultural change if they're going to be successful. They're not the tools. The tools are just they're tools in your tool belt. You got to figure out what it is you're trying to actually create and make happen. And what we have found with our clients, and I mean, this was kind of the big switch from the upfront. When I first started getting frustrated with those projects in that first client, I kind of doubled down on statistical analysis and trying to prove my point harder. And that wasn't actually the issue. Nobody could hear that conversation because I hadn't taken care of what we actually kind of consider the soft stuff, right? And the soft stuff in many ways is that's actually the hard stuff. It's actually kind of having that difficult conversation about what does success actually look like, and if you want to actually make that cultural change, that can't be something that leadership delegates and says train a bunch of my people and they'll make that happen. That's not where it is. It's about leadership actually kind of wandering in, getting uncomfortable, because a lot of the things that don't work in an organization are decisions we made in a boardroom or a conference room that made sense from a spreadsheet perspective and didn't make sense when I went out to the floor and actually saw what it was making happen. And being able to have those more challenging conversations with leadership lets them be a party to it. And if you want to make any positive culture change, leadership can't kind of sit on the sidelines and hope that's going to happen for them.
Yeah. So thinking, almost 20 or roughly 20 years later now, I mean, I think you've alluded to some adjustments that you made, Evans, of coming in with a proposal, trying to guide the client in a direction that might be more beneficial to them. What are some other adjustments that you've made to your approach based on those things that you were learning early on as being a consultant?
Yeah, so a big part of the change for us, and it's really, this is part of where Integris actually came from, kind of creating that firm. I've been doing continuous improvement work, and that predated Integris, but that whole shift in focus to say it's really about these other pieces. When we talk continuous improvement, frequently we talk about fixing a process, a business process. And what we really learned is there's a couple of really big processes that overarch the whole thing, that kind of make up our culture. And it's how leadership interacts, how we interact as teams and as individuals. It's the respect we have for each other, and whether we can actually hear each other. So when we talk with folks now, and the majority of our work is actually more in the emotional intelligence kind of field, and it's helping people better be able to interact. Because the communications between individuals and the respect that we can have about honoring the fact that we come to things from different perspectives, that's what really kind of sets the ground for being able to make any movement forward. And if I don't take care of those issues, my changes end up being surface changes. They're not sustainable, and they get cut down. I worked with one client where I honestly had a discussion with their senior leadership saying, here's part of the problem you guys have is it takes a village to say yes in this organization, and it takes an individual to say no. Kind of any progress forward, it's so easy to knock off even trying to move forward that you're wondering why your people aren't more creative because you've trained them. That's not going to serve them.
Yeah. So
we found that having those kinds of discussions have just been, it makes the continuous improvement work kind of simple for people. If as leaders, if we recognize that our people know this work better than we ever will, and we need to be listening to them, if I can actually make that shift in my mindset, that's what really helps us out. What we find so often is leaders and others in the organization, we may talk a good game, but we don't actually make that shift in our mindset. Somebody approaches something a little bit differently, we think they're wrong, not just different, not have a different perspective that we could learn from.
Yeah. And these are some different leadership mistakes that you've I think sketched out during the conversation. At the risk of making a mistake, this is not going to be the most respectful way of putting it, but I'm going to go for the joke here. When you talked about the village, in my mind, I almost thought you were going to say, and you're smart to not say it this way, it takes a village to say yes to an idea, but it only takes one idiot to say no. I don't know. I'm thinking of the phrase village idiot. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's perfect. I mean, because the real situation here is it's not that people are idiots. It's not that people are stupid at all. I mean, these were really smart people, but who hadn't gone through what was actually happening. They had kind of their own perspective of what was happening in the world, and they couldn't get out of that to hear a different perspective. It's
Right.
not at all. It's really sometimes our IQ is actually what gets in the way of our actually being able to move forward. So it's.
I mean, you're right. It's not. I mean, these executives and leaders and employees are not idiots. It fascinates me. Maybe this is why this is all studied so much. How an organization full of incredibly smart people can be organizationally stupid sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually where we came up with the book and kind of why we wrote the book. For a big part, what we see is we really value IQ very highly in business. But it's EQ, or emotional intelligence, that actually is probably going to be a better indicator of what we're able to successfully do in any kind of an organization where we've got more than one person there.
Yeah.
So kind of helping people shift that focus, because we need to be able to understand differences. And there's that aspect of, if somebody's got a different approach than me, that's the opportunity I have to learn.
Sure.
So.
Yeah. So Evans, let's talk about the book. Again, we're joined today by Evans Kerrigan. He's co-author of the book. The title is Solving the People Problem, subtitled Essential Skills You Need to Lead and Succeed in Today's Workplace. So let's talk about the title, Solving the People Problem. Like sometimes leaders, maybe back to your scenario, Evans, of being brought in to train people, like there's this implicit statement, well, the problem is my frontline staff. And if I could just train them on continuous improvement methods, they'll be better employees, will be more successful. That's not what you're implying with the title of the book, though. So
No.
Can you tell us more?
Yeah, not at all. Actually, I kind of come from the same school of thought that I think you do, Mark. Our people are never really the problem. What we have them doing might be a problem. What we ask of them, how we set them up potentially against one another in terms of rewards. There's all kinds of things that can be a problem. But when we talk about the people problem, it's not the people themselves. It's the fact that because we're all a little bit different and we all communicate a little bit differently, there's friction in the way in which we share ideas with one another and the way in which we can actually hear the lessons of one another. When I was in undergrad, way back, I remember one of my communications professors said, it's not what you say, it's what the other person actually hears. That's communication. And the reality is, we don't tend to hear what the other person is trying to say all that often. We tend to run it through filters of our own. And if we can get a little bit more aware of those filters, if we can understand a little bit our perspective as well as the perspective of other people, we have a much higher success rate with any ideas that we're carrying forward. And it's not about winning the point. It's about being able to actually just communicate more clearly and more openly. So we've used this kind of work with project teams that are working on projects, with organizations, to help people actually just be able to communicate with one another without some of that friction in the conversation. We talk about trying to create work relationships that really work. Right? We very rarely run into anybody who's really coming in to try and do bad work. That's not what's going on. But there may be some friction in the system. We may not understand exactly what they're asking. And all of that stuff leads to substandard performance for ourselves and for others. Yeah.
And I like that phrase you use, winning the point, whether it's a discussion in a meeting or trying to get some sort of proposal accepted. One lesson I've had to learn in my career is, the most logically correct idea isn't always going to win. And there are realities of politics, psychology, people being complicated. It took me a while to sort of get past feelings around like, well, it's not fair that my idea didn't get approved. I'm like, well, the organization maybe doesn't care about fairness, or, it could have been a different perspective. Maybe I didn't do enough when it came to, I know there were times where I didn't do enough when it came to relationships. And those are some mistakes that I've made in my career, just kind of being brought forth by the conversation here. But what are your thoughts here about helping people get past the idea of, my idea has to win versus finding what's really best for the organization?
Yeah, so part of that, here's where we're going to run into that whole leadership idea. Right? It's up to leaders to help communicate what actually is important to the organization. And if I hope everybody's going to kind of come across that, I'm setting up more and more of those instances where I feel like I've got to win because I have the right idea for the organization, or somebody else does. Part of it is just about how we clear those things up. And I think all too often we expect people know what it is we're trying to do, and that's got to be able to. We got to be able to have a conversation about that, a conversation where we can both hear one another. It's not a one-way conversation, right? So if we can learn from one another, we're actually starting to open up our ability to have more and more conversations about more and more interesting, impactful things so that we can contribute in a better way. So it's one of the ways it ties to leadership. And Mark, I'm like you. I mean, you really put it very well. That was my problem right up front. I was trying to come up with the perfect answer. But the results are going to be, what's the answer that's actually going to be implemented, not what's the perfect answer. And it really is.
I think back to relationships. Yeah. So on relationships, like there's a phrase that comes to mind. I think this is from the old late UCLA basketball coach John Wooden, or maybe it's attributed to other people. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yeah, and it has been used in a lot of places. I think I've heard that as an FDR quote. I've heard that in a bunch of different places.
Sure, yeah. I mean, Wooden might have heard it from somebody.
Yeah, it's one of those truisms that it was probably said by many, many people, because it is true. It is true. If I don't know that you're actually looking out for me, which is the case, unfortunately, in a lot of places for workers feeling about their leadership, it doesn't matter exactly what I say, because they're not watching what I say. They're watching what I do. And frequently we see those things not actually supporting one another. So we do a lot of work around leadership, around leaders gaining a little bit more self-awareness about what's really required of a leader. Because a leader, in our mind, a leader is more of a servant. A leader is not the boss. Right, a leader is a servant. Right, it's how can I help my people be so successful that I can't help but be successful because of it. So if I can understand what my people actually need in terms of my actions, in terms of my behaviors, in terms of my communication, it's really about the people I work with. And I can take that from a leader who's in a position of leadership, but I can take that from anybody in the workplace or even outside the workplace. Right? If I'm coming at this from a spirit of, if I understand you well enough, I can communicate in a way that helps you be more successful and helps me be more successful. And that's the way we really all ought to be kind of approaching this life.
Yeah. And it's difficult. I'm curious your thoughts on this dynamic of being brought in as an outside consultant. People sometimes look at you crossways, or what they give you what do they say? They give you kind of the side eye, like they don't know if they can trust you, especially if maybe if they don't trust their leadership. If you're brought in by leadership as a consultant, it took me a while to figure out, like, they're not, this isn't something I should take personally. It's not that they don't trust me. It's more of the position and the situation that I'm in. What have you learned, Evans, about trying to set things up where you're maybe not starting off behind the eight ball, if you will?
Well, I don't know that you get to choose whether you're going to start off behind the eight ball, because that's part of what the culture already is, right? When you come in,
sure.
For me, I would say the big thing is being authentic, and it's to one of the things you said, Mark. It's about showing that you actually care, showing that you're listening, that it's not about sides. It's about trying to help us all find a better way. And even if leadership may have brought me in, that doesn't mean I'm going to say what is going to just make leadership happy, right? And from my perspective, there was a wonderful book that came out several years ago. It was Employees First, Customers Second, something to that effect, where customers really do matter, absolutely, but I cannot serve the customer if I'm not serving the people who work here. That's going to come through. So, and I kind of believe that in kind of every fiber of my being. And it's so when I go out and I talk with people, I think it comes across relatively quickly that I'm caring for them. I don't come in with an answer, because I can't know their job as well as they do. I can help have some tools that may help open some stuff up for them, help them see things in a little bit different way. But I'll never know their job as well as I do. So I have great respect for people who I have the opportunity to actually work with and talk with, because they're great at what they do. There may just be some techniques, styles, whatever, that I can use to help them be able to be a little bit more effective. But it's up to them.
Yeah.
We've always viewed the consulting role as kind of like a whitewater river guide, if you will, right? We've been through the rapids, and we've done some of these improvement efforts, and we've done these things in the past, but it's never really our journey. At the end of the day, I've got to be somewhere else. Whatever the group got out of that, that's for the group. And our goal is that they can actually be leading a boat the next time themselves, right? They don't need us along the way. But it's never our journey. And I think one of the challenges that sometimes consultants make is thinking it's theirs. And it isn't. It's always the client's. I am only there. I'm the easiest person to get rid of, and I should be. Because if we're really talking about culture change, which we're talking about if we're talking about EQ, or we're talking about leadership, or we're talking about continuous improvement, at the end of the day, the organization has to own it. It can't be an outsider owning it. So.
Yeah, I think that's very true. So one final question for you, Evans. Again, the book is Solving the People Problem, Essential Skills You Need to Lead and Succeed in Today's Workplace. You've been consulting 20 years. Your career goes back before that, private sector and military. Is there a key change that comes to mind, thinking in terms of, what's different about today's workplace compared to, say, 20 years ago or more?
Wow, there are so many things that have changed, but I think most of those are just that's background. I think one of the things that's really interesting is technology has seemed to pick up in pace, and all these other things are happening. To be perfectly honest, I think that actually relationship, connection, emotional intelligence, those things have actually become more important, not less. It's the connections we make, and if I look around at the organizations I work with, almost everybody is realizing they actually aren't an individual at work. They are part of a group at work that can get things done together. The better they work with one another. And I think when we take it from that perspective, we try to actually increase our emotional intelligence, which is really malleable, what we find is the work gets better, the results get better, but also we get a little bit better, and life's a little bit more pleasant as well. So it has a really wonderful feedback loop that it sets up for itself. So I think it's actually that relationships become more important at the same time that technology seems to be running away from us in some ways.
Yeah, and I bet a lot of these essential skills for leaders are probably pretty timeless, even though that environment and that background changes.
They definitely are. When you take a look at it from a leadership perspective, technology is changing with Moore's Law kind of really quickly. At the same time, our adaptations don't move all that quickly. And in a lot of ways, we're reacting with a brain that was suited for several centuries ago, trying to kind of keep up and catch up. So those relationships and being able to support one another become really critical.
Yeah, well said, Evans. So the website for the book is www.solvingthepeopleproblem.com. I'll put a link in the show notes. Our guest again has been Evans Kerrigan. He's CEO and co-founder of the firm Integris Performance Advisors. What's the website for Integris?
The website for Integris is integrisperformanceadvisors.com. And if you go out there, you'll see a lot of our services, but a lot of the services around the EQ side of the stuff are going to be on that solving the people problem. And one of the things that we actually have out there is an EQ survey that you can actually take. And if any of your listeners would like to take that, if you go to solvingthepeopleproblem.com, click on the What's My Disc EQ, it will take you to a survey. And for this group, if you want to put in the word favorite, that will be your code to take the survey. And the survey is going to give you a little bit of what we consider the 4 key elements and how well you line up against those 4 key elements of emotional intelligence for yourself and for others. It's also going to give you ideas about what you can do to continue to increase your emotional intelligence in each of those 4 elements.
Well, very good. Thank you for sharing that, Evans. So again, Thank you so much for being a guest and sharing with us here today.
Thank you, Mark. This has been a wonderful conversation. Always great to talk to you.
All right, thanks.